Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading The House of 60 Fathers by Mindert de Jong. And I'm starting in the middle of chapter 4 on page 68 at the very bottom of the page. You see it at the bottom of the page. But first I want to review a little bit what has happened in this chapter. Tien Pao has gone up a cliff and has been able to see what the rumbling noise was that he had been hearing, that it's trucks, Japanese trucks. He also has watched as a plane crashed. The plane, first of all, had bombed the Japanese, but then it was hit by gunfire and it crashed. And the blonde pilot that he had transported across the river got out and was able to float downstream on a piece of wood. Meanwhile, he's trying to keep his pig quiet. As the pilot was going down the river, or maybe before he was going down the river, Tien Pao yelled out at him to watch out, that there was somebody coming after him, a Japanese was coming after him. Well, unfortunately, when he yelled out, the Japanese then knew that somebody was high on the hill, and so they started just firing up at the hill. Tien Pao had observed the American airman, and he stayed low to the ground and tried to carry the pig in such a way that the pig wouldn't rear up. So that's where we're starting on page 68. The little pig did not care to be dragged along on his side. He grunted, he struggled. Tien Pao forced him down again. Even that quick movement had been seen. A shot rang out. The bullet smashed against the polished boulder, bounced, and caroomed off with an angry, stinging whine. Something smacked hard against Tien Pao's cheek. He clapped his hand to his stunned cheek. His hand came away bloody. Before him lay the flattened slug of the bullet that had bounded from the rock and hit his cheek. Tien Pao stared at his bloody hand. He lay deathly still. It was suddenly silent down below in the valley. Then there were shouts far down the river, and Tien Pao knew horror, for he realized what the Japanese were doing. They were going after the airman in force. But meanwhile, one or two riflemen were keeping him on the high solitary cliff. That was all that was needed, just a bullet now and then to keep him on the cliff. And when they had the airmen, they'd come and get him. There were two shots far down the river. Much later, out of the stillness in the valley came a scream, a short scream cut off. Had they caught him? They must have caught the airman. They were torturing him. Now they would come across the river, mount the cliff to capture him and glory of the Republic. Tien Pao's outstretched hand clenched and unclenched around the bullet slug on the ground before him. He had to know, had to raise his head to see what was happening in the still valley. A sampan was leaving the opposite bank of the river, a sampan full of soldiers. It was heading straight for the cliff, coming for him. They were coming. They'd torture him too for what he had done. In his terror, Tien Pao forgot all caution. He flung himself up, fled headlong over the round top of the cliff. At his first lunge, the shots rang out. Tien Pao crazily threw himself ahead of the vicious whistling sound of bullets, threw himself over the round top of the cliff as if he could outrace bullets. Then he was over the cliff. For the moment, he was out of range of the rifleman, protected by the shoulder of the cliff, but he tore on at the blind, mad pace down the steep cliff. He fell, picked himself up, raced on again. Glory of the Republic bowled on behind him. They were at the little cave in which they'd spent the night. Without thinking, Tien Pao threw himself flat and started to crawl in. He backed right out again. He couldn't hide here. The Japanese would search every inch of the cliff, every hole and crevice. He had to get far away from this cliff. They raced on again. They left the lone cliff behind, ran back the way they'd come the night before, ran downriver the way the airmen had gone. Tien Pao did not know where he was going, but anywhere away from the cliff and the bullets, any place was better. Then the thought struck him. If the Japanese had not yet caught the American airmen, this whole country downriver would be full of searching parties. He forced himself to slow down, be cautious, listen. He mustn't go crashing along paths to run full tilt into the Japanese. He had to hide at once. He left the path and edged up the first cliff that looked as if it might provide shelter and concealment. The squat cliff was strewn with huge rocks, and all the tight spaces between the rocks were jammed with brush and thorns. It was terrible, impossible climbing. Glory of the Republic lagged more and more behind. Tien Pao had to wait for him. At the spot where Tien Pao stood waiting, the leaves lay heaped high in the split of a rock. This wasn't a cave, just a narrow crevice open to the sky, but it might be possible to hide behind the high-piled leaves. It would have to do. Glory of the Republic was grunting so painfully. Tien Pao knew he could hardly climb any more. He grabbed a handful of leaves, held them out, crunched and rattled them to coax the little pig on. Then he attacked the piled leaves, raking and pawing them away with both hands to get at the crevice. Tien Pao stopped for a moment, looked back to see if Glory of the Republic was coming. In the momentary quiet, there was a rattling in the leaves, not of Tien Pao's making. Swift as a snake, a hand stuck through the piled leaves. The hand grabbed Tien Pao's throat. Tien Pao's startled scream was cut off as a savage grip closed around his throat. He was jerked off his feet, head first into that pile of leaves. In his terror, Tien Pao thrashed so fiercely in the leaves, Glory of the Republic became frightened and bolted down the cliff. In the crevice of the rock, Tien Pao's terrified eyes stared at the white, botched face. Singed hair. It was the airman. His airman. His river god. The airman did not know him. His grip tightened around Tien Pao's throat, and the other hand clamped over Tien Pao's mouth so hard. Tien Pao's lips crushed down on his teeth. He tasted blood. His eyes stared out of their sockets. He felt himself going limp. Dimly he still heard a rustling among the leaves, as if far away, but the airman whipped around to face whatever was coming. Then, Glory of the Republic burst through the piled leaves. The startled airman looked from the pig to the boy. He was choking. Immediately, he released his hold on Tien Pao. A great gush of air sobbed into Tien Pao's empty lungs. He shook his head to clear his eyes. He managed a sick little smile. The man grinned back, but he looked terribly puzzled. Then Tien Pao realized that dirty as he was, thin and starved and caked with paddy mud, the airman had not recognized him. If it hadn't been for Glory of the Republic. Tien Pao rubbed his throat, let out his breath in one big nervous gasp. He knew the airman could not imagine why he and the pig were here, but how could he tell them? Tien Pao pointed up to the sky. Then he made his hand go spiraling down, the way the airplane had gone down. He cupped his hands to his mouth as if shouting a great shout, and then pointed to himself. The airman grinned, nodded. He understood. They sat grinning at each other. They had no words. The airman began building up the disturbed leaf pile again, but Tien Pao leaned back against the rock pile with a great tired sigh. Now he was safe. He laughed a little. He felt so safe with the airman, even though the Japanese might be all around. The airman turned to look at him. Tien Pao looked back at the airman and laughed until tears filled his eyes. Then he wasn't laughing. He was crying. Now he was safe, but he was crying, and right before the airman. Tien Pao turned his shamed face away. He grabbed the little pig and pulled him to his chest. He tried to muffle the hand-wrenching sobs against the little pig's muddy hide. Tien Pao did not know that this was shock and the reaction from the terrible danger now that he was suddenly safe. But the airman knew. He reached over, pushed the pig away, and took Tien Pao into his own lap. He sat and rocked the sobbing Tien Pao gently, slowly, like a mother. And the airman, in the soft, sweet relief of his own escape from death, crooned like a mother to a little baby. I know how you feel, little fellow. You don't have to be ashamed. I know how it feels to be shot at. And here's a picture of them. Tien Pao did not understand, but the words were soothing. And at last he managed to grin up at the man. At once the airman poked his fingers into Tien Pao's hollow stomach. It must mean, have you eaten? Tien Pao dashed the tears away and sat up eagerly. He shook his head. He grabbed a leaf and crunched it between his teeth to show what he'd been eating. The airman made a face. He began digging in his pockets. Tien Pao could not keep his eyes away from the man's searching hand. At last, the airman drew a bar of chocolate from one of his many pockets. He broke off a morsel and gave it to Tien Pao. He started to give Glory of the Republic a tiny piece, but with a wry grin, he gave the little pig a handful of leaves instead and handed the second morsel to Tien Pao. Tien Pao kept the second little piece of chocolate pinched between his fingers while he slowly chewed the first little piece. He slowly let it melt in his mouth. He let it trickle around his teeth, and then slowly, oh, very slowly and sweetly, flowed down his throat. Never in his life had he tasted anything so heavenly. After it was gone, he licked around his lips for any leftover droplet of chocolate, and then there was still the other little piece. Now he could do it all over again. Let it melt, let it trickle, let it slide in all its sweetness to his gnawing stomach. He closed his eyes. He rocked himself in the joy of it. When he opened his eyes, the chocolate was gone. He badly wanted to ask for more. His stomach all but screamed for more, but he did not ask, for he suspected that the one bar of chocolate was all the airman had. One piece to break a crumb from now and then in the days and nights ahead. Their days and nights ahead. Why, now he wouldn't be alone anymore. Tien Pao laughed softly up at the airman. The airman closed his arm around Tien Pao. He understood. It didn't need words. Together, they suddenly tensed, sat up. Down below in the unseen valley, the rumble had begun. The grinding sound of trucks came through the wall of leaves. It must mean that the Japanese had abandoned the search. The convoy was on its way again on the road in the valley. They looked at each other and Tien Pao opened his mouth to say something, but the airman laid a finger on his lips. He must mean that it might be a trick and that they still must be cautious. All the Japanese had not necessarily gone on with the convoy. All the same, Tien Pao and the airman both leaned against the rock wall of the crevice, and together they sighed their relief. The bubbling feeling of wonderful safety was so enormous in him. Tien Pao somehow had to indicate how he felt. Somehow he had to tell the airman that they would go on together. He closed his eyes as if in sleep and pointed to them. That had to indicate the night. He made his fingers walk along his legs, made them climb, made them go down. It had to mean that when night came, they would set out through the dark river mountains together. But the airman looked anxious. First, he pulled Tien Pao's face close to him and peered at his wounded cheek. He tossed his head to indicate it looked all right, but then he raised his own trouser leg and showed Tien Pao an ugly, gaping wound, an awful, deep, huge burn. The burn already looked poisonous, tinged green-black around the edges. The airman made his fingers walk, pointed to his leg, and shook his head. It meant he could not walk. He groaned and ran the tip of his tongue around his lips. That must mean the wound was making him sick and feverish after the struggle to get to this hideout. Tien Pao nodded and nodded to show that he completely understood. To further show it, he hastily began making a bed of the leaves. He indicated that the airman should lie down and sleep. He opened his own eyes wide and held them open with his fingers to tell the man that he would keep watch. The man nodded eagerly, stretched out. Almost the next moment, he was asleep. Tien Pao sat beside the airman, hovering over him, watching, ready to lay his hand over the man's mouth, for the airman tossed in an unhappy, feverish sleep, and often he talked out in his foreign tongue, and no one must hear. It was so unbelievably good not to be alone, so good to be with a human being. Nothing must separate them again until they got to Hanyang. Well, that was a kind of a happier chapter, but I wonder, what are they going to do? If the airman can't walk, is Tien Pao going to leave him to get help? Or is he going to stay with him until help comes or until the airman is feeling better? Well, we'll find out in the next chapter. Bye-bye.